Welcome to Tales of Teltra by D.H. McCormack. Episode 1, Part 2. Farin didn't know how long he had been asleep when something shook his shoulder gently. He opened his eyes. It was still night and the moon was gone. Only the stars were visible high above and shadows moving around him. Farin grasped at his sword. As quickly as he did, a strong hand grabbed his wrist. "No, Ruharan, we will not hurt you," came a man's voice, thick with an accent Farin did not recognize. "Your wound, it is not good. You need to come with us. Can you stand?" Farin shook his head slowly, then, realizing how dark it was, stuttered, "My arm, I think it's broken." "Ah, yes, I see. Here, this will work," the man replied as he let go of Farin's wrist, then gently put a loop of cloth over Farin's head and tucked it about his injured arm. "Our camp is not far. We will go slow," he said as he helped Farin to his feet. Something licked his fingers, causing him to jump and look around. He could just make out the shape of a massive dog moving about his feet, panting heavily. "It was not easy to find you by starlight, even for us, but Beor has a good sense of smell," the man said as he helped Farin hobble slowly through the woods, across the uneven ground. Farin hung on to the man's arm, too terrified to speak. His head was still swimming, his vision blurred, and a cold sweat trickled down his forehead. More than a few times he nearly fell, and the man had to catch Farin under his arms to stop him from keeling headfirst into the ground. Farin had no idea who this man was, or where he was taking him, but he did know one thing. There was nothing he could do but follow. After what felt like hours of slow progress, Farin noticed an orange glow through the trees ahead. As he drew closer, he smelt the wood smoke, heard the crackle of the fire. Slowly, his companion's face became visible. He was older than Farin, maybe the same age as Jotir, with deep lines across his olive skin and dark curly hair tied back in a short bun. "You are young," the man said, surprised as he looked over at Farin. Then, with a frown, "Boys in the woods waving their swords about looking to grow rich." He seemed more sad than angry, but he snorted with exasperation as they reached the edge of the fire and he eased Farin down to the ground. "Juhan! Look what they do now. They bring their sons to hunt for them." A second man, presumably Juhan, sat on the other side of the campfire. He was younger than the first man, and also had the olive skin and dark hair. He was sharpening a small blade and replied without looking up. Farin could not understand. The language was strange to him. "You are not showing our guest respect," the older man replied flatly. "Fine, I will speak their tongue," Juhan retorted, looking up from his work. "It would have been better, Alith, if we had left him for the forest." "Dolal, Juhan. He is just a boy." There was a finality in Alith's tone, and Juhan waved his hand silently, then returned to honing the edge of his knife on the smooth stone in his hand. "Do not listen, Ruharan. He forgets himself. We have been away from home for too long." Alith crouched next to Farin, gently removing the bandage and blood-soaked packing from his wound. The surrounding skin was red and inflamed, and yellow pus oozed from the gouge. The wound burnt, and Farin bit his lip, trying not to cry. He felt like such a child. Alith rolled out a leather pack on the floor. Inside were perhaps a dozen small pockets, each containing a flask, a roll of cloth, or metal instrument which reflected the firelight. Taking one of the flasks, Alith pulled the cork and poured its contents over Farin's wound. Relief instantly washed over Farin. The burning sensation was gone, the pain receding. Alith picked up one of the metal instruments next, a small metal stick with a wooden handle and a silver ball on one end. He held it in the flames until the ball glowed red. "You will smell burning, but it will not hurt," Alith said calmly as he returned to Farin and pressed the ball into the wound. Farin flinched but felt nothing. He looked down. He could see smoke rising from his skin, smell his flesh cooking, but there was no pain. Even in his broken forearm, he felt nothing more than a dull ache. After rebinding the wound, Elith fitted a splint and sling to Farin's arm, then sat next to the fire and passed Farin some dense brown bread. "You must eat, then sleep. In the morning we will take you back to your lands." Farin's eyes felt like stones and his body was exhausted, yet he looked about, peering into the dark beyond the firelight. "What about the waterhounds or wolves or something? Won't they find us while we sleep?" Elith cocked his head to the side as if listening. Shortly, he looked back at Farin and smiled. "There is a pack of waterhounds maybe 10 miles down the river. They will not harm us. As for the female that charged you off the cliff, well, that can wait until morning. You will see. Besides that, it is only birds and deer. You can lie here, Ruhan, next to Beor. He will keep you safe if you are worried." Farin did not understand how Elith could know any of what he just said. Beor nuzzled his hand and pressed his bulk up against Farin's leg. He was too tired to think. He didn't know what to say, how to feel, how to thank these strangers, anything. As he lay on the ground and Beor snuggled down beside him, all he could manage before sleep took him was a mumbled, "Elith, you saved me." Farin woke to the smell of roast game and the sound of bird song. He was lying in the same position he had been in when he fell asleep the night before, flat on his back with his injured arm resting across his chest and staring up at the now brightening sky. He must have slept like a corpse. He sat up carefully, trying not to jolt his arm, and looked about. The sun had not yet risen, but daybreak was quickly approaching and small birds dipped and dived about them in the growing light. They were camped in a broad hollow, lined with trees, 2 sides of which were enclosed by a steep bank, and the third by the base of a massive fallen oak, a maze of dangling roots and earth torn from the ground. The 4th side was open, and in that direction, just through the canopy of the dense forest, Farin could make out the ridgeline from which he had fallen, the river tumbling over its edge and the green gold of the seraph trees swaying in the breeze. Last night it had seemed like he and Elith had walked for hours, but in reality they had not traveled far at all. Beor breathed heavily next to Farin and nuzzled his shoulders as if in greeting, and then went back to watching Juhan turn some plucked and skewered pigeons over the fire, salivating and shifting his paws impatiently. Juhan looked over at Farin as he sat up, but immediately returned his attention to the cooking food without a word. Farin struggled to his feet awkwardly and then scratched Beor behind his ear, working his fingers into his long, dark brown coat, and Beor wagged his tail appreciatively. Farin was staring out towards the seraph glade when Elith returned carrying 2 full water skins. "Sleep looks to have done you much good, Ruharan," he said, as he entered the hollow from behind the fallen oak. "This is a good sign, very good," said Elith. Elith held a water skin aloft so Farin could drink from it one-handed. The water was cold and sweet, fresh from the river. When he had finished, Elith nodded, then turned and started to break down the camp and pack it away. Farin wiped his mouth with his sleeve, looking at his new companions while they worked. They seemed even stranger to him in the daylight. Their clothes were the first thing that struck him. They wore straight-cut, earthy yellow trousers and long-sleeved tops of a pale green, all of which was made from a material Farin had never seen before. It hung lightly, yet had the look of something tough and durable. Their skin was darker than Farin had ever seen. Their hair was thick, glossy black, and the words of their language rolled into one another indistinguishable as they spoke back and forth. More questions bubbled up in his head than he knew how to ask, and he stood silently until he found the right words. "The name you keep calling me, Ruharan?" The word felt strange in his mouth as he spoke. "What does it mean?" Elith looked up from packing away a bedroll, surprised. "It means man of the wind. It is the name of your people, no? Or so it was told to me. Maybe I pronounce it wrong?" Suddenly, Farin understood, and his cheeks flushed. "Oh no, I think you are right, but only our lords and sages speak Old Ruhari, though," he replied. "It is only as Lord Rain said to me before," Elith replied with a shrug. "Perhaps I will ask him when I next see him." It was Farin's turn to be surprised. "You know Lord Rain?" Farin asked eagerly. "We talk from time to time when we meet in these woods," Elith replied, then paused and stood up. "Is it Lord Rain who brought you into these woods?" he asked. Farin nodded. Elith erupted furiously, his eyes flashing. "What was he thinking? We will have strong words when I see him again. Strong words!" Farin had no idea how to respond. He had never heard anyone speak about a lord in such a way, much less Lord Rain. He silently sat down next to Bear again while Aleth shoved strange-looking tools into a large pack with his brow furrowed. Shortly the pigeons were fully cooked, and Aleth took one and pulled the meat off its bones, which he then put on a plate and handed to Farin. "I am sorry," he said as he sat beside Farin. "I should not have spoken about your lord in such a way. I am just surprised. I always thought he was wise." "Oh, but he is," Farin replied. "He is the greatest hunter alive. He knows the old wood better than any. We were just unlucky, I think." Farin went quiet again, trying not to think of Jotir on the ground, of the waterhound bearing down on him. "Does he not know it? I wonder," Aleth said, then looked down again, pensive as he picked the meat from the pigeon on his own plate. Shortly he turned and looked at Farin again. "Your people come here to fight and to take from the forest, so it fights back. We, Beor and I, share an oath with the forest. We come to care for it, so it cares for us. Do you understand?" Farin shook his head, confused. "How can the old wood look after someone? It's a forest. It's not alive." "Not alive, no." Aleth scratched his face and looked up, searching for the words. "But not dead either. It is something different. It is hard to explain in your language." "Ah, do not expect the boy to learn," Juhan interjected as he doused the fire. "It is not possible for them. They have their ways, we have ours." Juhan joined them, sitting to eat his own plate of pigeon meat. "I am not so sure, Juhan," Aleth replied. "Perhaps he is not yet too old to understand. But it is easier to show than it is to tell," Alice said, then tossed the stripped bones from his plate into the smoldering fire. The sun was peeking above the tree canopy, casting the clearing about them in golden light as they broke camp. Juhan forged ahead, leading them back into the woods and heading towards the cliff face, while Aleth kept pace beside Farin, helping him as he struggled through the forest. Farin marveled at how easily Juhan moved, skipping over rocks and roots alike while Beor ran beside him. He thought that Jotir and Lord Rain had been sure-footed, but compared to these woodsmen, they now seemed only stumbling babes. Shortly, they reached the cliff face, then followed it west a short ways until they met the waterfall. Smooth stones jutted out from the cliff here and there, breaking the fall of water, causing it to splash out in a mist and coat the surrounding rocks and ferns in a glistening wet sheen. At the base of the waterfall was a low overhang which created a narrow way passing behind the falling water. Farin followed Juhan as he crouched and passed through to the other side. Beyond the river, the path ran to the cliff face once more. They followed it until the cliff became a steep slope, and then flat ground where they left the path and turned back on themselves, walking uphill through the undergrowth. It was nearly noon by the time Farin could hear the river and the waterfall once more. Juhan was crouched among the ferns when Farin reached the crest of the hill. He waved Farin over and motioned for him to crouch too, then pointed down towards the river. Bear had already crossed to the other side and was sitting beside the seraph trees, waiting. Farin's stomach clenched tight as he saw a large brown shape emerge from behind the hanging branches. The waterhound slowly approached Beor, then stopped and sniffed the air. Its ears flattened against its head, and it turned to stare directly up at Farin, curling its lips back over its teeth. Instantly, Beor was on his feet, a low growl rumbling in his throat. The waterhound looked back to Beor, then to Farin again. Finally, it snorted and walked over and sat before Beor, bending its head low to the ground. Everything inside Farin told him to get up and run, to get as far away as he could. Aleth rested a hand on Farin's shoulder. "Peace, Ruharan. You are safe. It will not attack. The creatures of the wood listen to Beor." Farin watched dumbfounded as the waterhound lifted its head and twitched its ears, then lay peacefully on the ground at Beor's feet. "He is like some kind of lord here, then?" Farin asked, trying to make sense of what was in front of him. A large grin split across Aleth's face. "It is a strange thing to say, but maybe yes. Look, it is safe for us to go down now." Beor was looking up at them expectantly, tongue hanging out one side of his mouth, panting. The waterhound did not take its eyes off Farin as the three men descended the slope and crossed the river. Terror still swirled deep within Farin's stomach, and his hands began to shake as Aleth led him closer. The waterhound sat up on its haunches as Farin came nearer, leaving its front paws to dangle in front as it continued to stare. Its eyes were glassy black, like two pebbles taken from the riverbed, and it twitched its white whiskers and cocked its head as Farin stood before it, frozen and staring up into its face. He could hear it breathing in, and then out through its nose. feel its breath on his face as he thought of the teeth hidden within its closed jaws. Then, ever so slowly, the waterhound bowed its head. Beor licked Farin's hand and looked from Farin to the waterhound. "He wants you to touch its head," Aleth said. "What?" Farin spun to look at Aleth. Shock was written across Aleth's face. "I do not understand, but Beor says you must do this." Beor licked Farin's hand again, then pressed himself up against Farin's leg. The waterhound had not moved and was waiting patiently, head still bowed. Farin hovered between action and inaction. Abject fear mingled with a strange new longing. Both swirled within him. Slowly, Farin lifted his hand and reached forwards, palm flat and fingers stretched out. His hand hovered an inch away from the forehead of the massive beast, so close he could feel the heat radiating from its body. Then the waterhound leaned forward and pressed its head against Farin's hand. For a time, they all stood there frozen, man and beast alike, and a deep peace fell over the wood. Even the birds fell silent, and the wind itself seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, all of Farin's fear melted away. He felt the glossy smoothness of the waterhound's coat, the rise and fall of its breathing, and the forest around him was suddenly transformed. The dark shadows became shade to rest in, the looming trees a welcome cover over his head. All at once, he felt like he was somewhere he belonged. There was a heavy thud of quick footsteps fast approaching from along the riverbank. The waterhound growled, then dipped back onto all fours and disappeared into the sarif grove. Moments later, Lord Rain burst into the clearing from among the trees and skidded to a halt, staring wide-eyed at Farin and the woodsman. He rushed forward and took hold of Farin's face, looking him over. "You are alive," he breathed, staring at Farin. "I can scarce believe it." His face was flushed and large dark rings hung under his eyes. "Jotir is alive. He's with your mother back at the farm. Balin stayed with him, but I rode out at first light in the hope of finding you, and here you are, alive!" Rain let out a sharp laugh and clapped Farin's shoulder, causing him to wince. "Ah, sorry, lad," he said, looking down at the sling around Farin's arm. "I see you have been well cared for." Rain turned to face the woodsman. "Aleth, I do not have the words to thank you, my friend. I owe you a great debt," he said, and bowed solemnly. Aleth looked at Lord Rain for a long while, his gaze cold and hard. Finally he spoke. "You should take this boy back home, Rain. You are lucky not to have his blood on your hands." Lord Rain stared back, then looked down, unable to meet the woodsman's gaze. Yes, I just thought to," he replied, then sighed. "You are right, Aleth. It shall not happen again." Rain turned to look at Farin once more. "We will have you home and in a soft bed before nightfall, boy. You have my word." "Thank you for coming back for me, my lord," Farin mumbled in reply, then bowed his head. He struggled to process what had just happened. The wood seemed much the same as it had, the birds now singing again and the wind blowing in the branches above, yet it felt different. "Yes, well, naturally," Lord Rain replied in a clipped tone. "Now go say your thanks and your farewells, and we will be off." Rain did not meet Aleth's gaze, who was still staring at Rain. Farin turned to the woodsman, searching for the right words. "Aleth, thank you. I can't say—" Aleth cut off Farin by raising his hand. "Some things are best left unsaid, especially if you are not sure what to think. Do you understand?" he said, then looked over at the sarif grove where the waterhound had disappeared minutes before. Farin nodded. "It is time for you to return home. Farin? Is that what Lord Rain called you?" Aleth asked. Farin nodded again. "Stranger and stranger," Aleth said to himself, then took Farin's good hand and pressed it to his own forehead. "May you find peace, Farin, man of the wind, until we meet again." And to you, Aleth. And you too, Juhan," Farin replied, unsure if he should do something in response. "May you find peace," Juhan intoned flatly, eyeing Farin warily, then turned and crossed back over the river. Aleth raised his hand to Lord Rain, then turned and followed Juhan back into the woods. Beor was suddenly at Farin's side, nuzzling into his legs. Farin crouched and took the dog's head in his hands. "Thank you," Farin said simply, then with a grin added, "My lord." Beor licked Farin's face, then bounded off across the river to catch up to the woodsmen who were now disappearing into the trees. Farin felt sad to watch them go so suddenly, to leave so much unsaid. It was mid-afternoon when Lord Rain and Farin left the wood. Both sat atop Rain's horse with Farin in front. The sky was bright, and the sun high, and the wind picked up now that they were out in the open country once more. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, moving slowly but steadily in their direction. "Storm's coming, lad. We had better make haste," Rain said. Farin turned his head to the side and looked back at the old wood once more. The wind blew in sharp, cold gusts, and the trees danced in reply.